So yeah, welcome everyone. I mean, this is the second of our events, and really this is what a startup community intention looks like. Trying to create a place to speak about cannabis, all things cannabis in the emerging market, emerging industry, and the emerging state. Well, things are happening globally really rapidly. We find ourselves in a position where if we're not talking about it today, then it's going to be a limited amount of people engaged in this industry. There's jobs, there's business opportunities, there's a trail of pain associated with this plant in communities extremely disproportionately affected in our neck of the woods and beyond. So our intention is to create space, create conversation, hear voices, hear perspective that can help us continue this conversation in a way that creates broader scope. So my name is Zach Sarkis. I'm with the NIR Kemp Lab, and our mission and vision is to engage through education, to support businesses and individuals, as well as help facilitate the process of growth of the industry in a way that's equitable, accessible, and really helping our region grow. This is Mary Kruger to my right.
I'm Mary Kruger. I'm the founder and executive director of BRAC Normal. So we are the Rochester chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I've been working with Zach for about a year. Our missions align really closely. Our mission as Normal is really simple. It's to educate folks about responsible cannabis consumption and the benefits that can have in communities, and then also be advocating for smart reform around laws surrounding marijuana prohibition. So, when we started up as BRAC Normal, it was, met Zach pretty early on, and the community that we've built is, it's small, but it's growing, and we just need more folks involved in this conversation in the community. And then we linked up with Kate about 6 or 7 months ago, and I'll let Kate introduce herself.
So I'm Kate Washington. I'm with Own Rochester, and we are a not-for-profit organization that launches, invests in, and grows worker-owned businesses. And our goal, of course, in collaborating in this particular network is to really encourage the development and the growth of worker-owned businesses within the cannabis space. As we're all aware, there's very, very strong opportunity for growth in this particular industry. And I think that there's an even stronger opportunity for building wealth in communities that have already been disproportionately affected negatively by the past marijuana laws. So my goal is to make sure that those people who've been in that situation are available to the information that they need to make sure that they can also be a part of the business opportunities and to be able to grow and build wealth within that segment.
So we're the super team.
So together we're going to make this happen in Rochester. And so as BRAC Normal, being the kind of the voice of cannabis consumers, it's important for us to spread that message that Kate was just talking about and that Zach was talking about, and the need for diversity and equity among this industry, because we know in states that have legalized before us, that's not what we've seen happen. So it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take community work to make sure that this happens in New York and more so here in Rochester.
And so again, this is the second of 4 events that are intended to be a listening series. We want to have y'all listen to a little bit of what we know to create the context, but also receive feedback to understand how we can make this more of a place for conversation and engagement and building out forward. Because we have our voices, we have our groups, our circles of influence, but really your word goes as far as the ears that are listening in both ways.
I would have to say, just to start off, that I'm a little disappointed right now, because as I look among the group that's assembled here, it really is representative of what we see currently in all of the meetings and all of the work around developing opportunities around cannabis, and it's often disproportionately white, middle class people who have been engaged and who are benefiting from this particular opportunity, and yet the people who are most affected negatively by it are often people of color, and they are the least represented here. So I'm a little disappointed, but we are having meetings all over the city, and we've actually, all of the neighborhood groups that you see on that little mural, there were all of them got information on this, so I sent information. So if you have not, if you know those people who might be interested, we'll be holding 2 other meetings before the end of the year, one in the northeast part of town and one in the northwest. So if you have an opportunity, I would love to really have you share the information out broadly as well.
Totally. And that's, again, it's how far our circles of influence go. And it's strategic partnerships, strategic relationships, and people who have interest that can help carry the message. It's not about us, it's more about creating the community and container to keep it building. Yeah. Oh.
So I think I just started like the background about cannabis, just some basic information for the conversation to be around. So when we say cannabis, we are talking hemp, we're talking marijuana, we're talking all things cannabis. So cannabis is the overarching plant that both marijuana and hemp fall under. They're all really the same. The difference is the amount of THC. It's 0.3% THC or less is hemp, and over that is considered marijuana. So really that's the only difference. And then the 2 plants are used for different things. So Zach, I'll let you speak well to this.
I mean, and just to be clear, that designation, THC gets you high, 0.3% was an arbitrary number that came up with by a Canadian scientist who was basically looking at numbers saying, okay, we think we can come up with this. Some states are looking as high as 2%. But realistically, there's plants that are cultivated for the resin. There's, that could be THC, that could be CBD, which is a boom word. You could be buying that at a gas station right now. There's plants that are cultivated for their fiber, whether that be the clothing material or the building material or the fiberglass that is BMW's building their European models of cars, which is super interesting. There's also the grain, which is a superfood. Those grain plants tend to have very little resin in them, but it's a food that's been cultivated across the world for millennia. We're talking about the plant that's like, you can trace it back to like the Iceman, who had hemp seeds and in his pouch. It's like there's really this ancient relationship with this plant. Again, there's some that are the whole world of resin right now. Today, there's thousands of acres of CBD being grown, and this is a plant that looks like marijuana, smells like marijuana, can taste like marijuana. It just doesn't have that psychotropic aspect to it, and so that industry is here today. It was legalized in 2018 with the federal farm bill across the nation. Technically, states have been able to grow hemp since 2014, but it was through relationships with the university done as a research partner. So I, as a research partner, has to sign up with the state, work with Cornell, send my research to them, which is simple as what does it do in this soil type. It's not super complex, but there's some steps to get there. And so as we begin to talk about the resin plants, that's when we begin. We're going to see like fiber and grain. There's going to be it's going to be a commodity crop. It's going to be grown, as if corn was and soy. When we begin to see the resin plants, the CBD and the THC, that's when we're going to look at recreational adult use cannabis. That's when we're going to see, again, these CBD crops that'll be medical, be recreational. Recreational is the stuff you can go get over the counter right now. At a gas station, for example, or you go to one of those nice CBD shops. And then there's the whole world of medical marijuana, which is, that's even more controlled. That's going to be really quality, clean product that's consistent, especially in New York State. We have the most stringent rules about what marijuana is. So as we begin to talk about where there's opportunities, there's probably opportunities for employment for medical, but it's incredibly expensive to enter, and that's one of those things. This is an industry that in most cases recreational has really high overhead to get involved, and so when we're talking about business opportunities, that's something we can talk more about later. So kind of big picture, there's this spectrum of the hemp plant. There's high regulation with the resins in the medical recreational, then there's this kind of middle zone of the CBD, then we have the grain and the fiber. So that's just kind of the picture that we're talking, when we talk cannabis, we're talking about all things considered.
So Zach touched on the medical piece of it. We do have a medical marijuana program in New York right now. It has really strict regulations around it and what's allowed in the program. So flower is the smokable part of the plant that's not allowed in the medical marijuana program right now. And there's a lot of health reasons behind that, but it's something that patients and just consumers across the board want to see in the program. So we consider it a limitation of the program right now. But there is the medical program is always changing through regulations. So last year, chronic pain was added as a qualifying condition to enter into the medical program. Previously, it was really difficult. There was like 12 qualifying conditions, and it was really difficult for folks to get into it, but it's a lot easier now that chronic pain is one of the qualifying conditions, and then also opiate use disorder, and for anything that opiates can be prescribed for, medical marijuana can be recommended for in New York. So we're making progress, but there's still a lot of work that's needed to make our medical program a good one.
But one of the other limitations of the medical licenses is that there are only 5 licenses in the entire state for medical. So that was the way the legislation was rolled out a few years ago when it first started. There were only 5 licenses. So even though you have access to probably more symptoms, hi, how are you? The licensing is spread around the state, and Rochester happens to have one of them.
Yeah, and so when initially the state rolled out the program, there was 5 vertically integrated licenses that were put out that could be bid on, and they were $200,000 to bid on, and then you also had to have like your complete business infrastructure already set up and ready to go when you were applying. So it was really upwards of like $5-6 million. And so now I believe there's 10 or 11 licenses throughout the state. They did open it up, but still that's a very limited number, and you still had to have that same upfront capital to be able to have a chance at getting one of those licenses.
And from a patient perspective too, it's incredibly expensive to get access to this stuff.
But when you say there's a limited number of licenses, all of those licenses have already been issued.
Yeah.
And they're issued to
The people who end up,
so Kate, when you said
They're primarily national corporations
Yeah.
that have
Yeah.
actually been distributing in other states. So when they found out that New York State was opening up, they just sought opportunities for licensing here. At that time, they were about $250,000 a license. So you already had to have a pretty, well-established portfolio of businesses around the country to afford to do it. So, even though it was expensive, my guess is that the next legislation, when they issue licenses, they will probably not be at that scale, but there will certainly be a cost associated with licenses, even for the unregulated cannabis licenses. So what it looks like is very much, again, like this room. People who have the access to resources and wealth will be the people who most likely benefit, unless we are able to really get enough people engaged with information so that they can.
I just want to be clear when you're saying, though, as this goes forward and there's the unregulated market still needs some sort of a license.
Correct. There will be a licensing for actual work with the plant. Yeah. But there will be other opportunities that are probably the ancillary businesses that will not require a license, are businesses that would support the growth and the growing industries.
But if I'm growing hemp for fiber today, how am I doing? Do I have to have any kind of license?
yeah, so it's a permit, and your permit, it's a $500 permit, which isn't cheap, but also considering how expensive it is to get into the world of cannabis, it's actually relatively affordable. So I think a lot of it will be, no matter where your hands are, whether it be hemp or cannabis, to be able to work with the plant, there's probably going to be some form of permitting fee, just because traceability will be a big play, making sure chain of custody, whoever's holding the plant, touching the plant, there's got to be some kind of, it's got to be able to go back to the source. That's what we see in other states of they call it the seed to sale tracking. But yeah, right now if you wanted to grow hemp, you could, and there's Ag and Markets has a website where you can look at the application, for example. But this actually leads into what's existing today for marijuana laws versus what's being proposed. And another thing the Roc NORML group has done has been really champions down in Albany, like knocking on doors month after month, to actually provide facts and information to build out what we consider a very fair, equitable, and accessible industry versus something that's just owned by the few. And that takes like literally people knocking on doors and calling people out for the baloney that we see out there from a perspective of, oh yeah, it's all good. Like we don't really need to worry about this. Like there's so many layers to it. So right now we're operating under decriminalization. So marijuana is decriminalized, but it's been decriminalized since
1977.
77. And under decriminalization, there's been millions of arrests in New York alone. And so there was this big push that, oh yeah, here we are, we've got decriminalization. Cuomo came out like it was a big success, but really what it did is just say you can basically hold more cannabis on you for less of a cost. It does away with some of the loopholes, like the stop and frisk loopholes, where so many people have been going to jail because having cannabis on your person isn't illegal, or isn't like it's not something that you can be incarcerated for, but as soon as someone says stop and empty your pockets, now it's in public view and you can go to jail for that. And so that's been something that rooted in why so many people have been incarcerated, especially, so today we're under decriminalization and it was touted as a success, but it's really just like, it's a deflection for the loss of not actually legalizing and legalizing in a way that creates a comprehensive system that allows for equity, allows for reinvestment into communities disproportionately affected by the war on drugs and the prohibition of cannabis.
Yeah, so, and with the decriminalization, in addition to closing those loopholes, there was automatic expungement created for folks who'd been previously arrested or prosecuted for those low-level possession charges that were previously misdemeanors. But like Zach said, it just is a step in the right direction. It isn't even full decriminalization because we have a whole ecosystem of cannabis, right? We have possessing cannabis, we have growing it, selling it. All of those pieces are still criminal, and disproportionately we're still going to see people from low-income communities, mostly people of color, being impacted by these criminal laws. And so we also know that once we move to a state of regulation and legalization, that doesn't make racism disappear, and we still see disproportionately people of color and people from low-income communities impacted after legalization, but it's at a much smaller level than what we're seeing now, and the impacts aren't as severe as what we're seeing now.
And so you want to talk about a little bit what's being proposed?
So the bill that we're trying to pass is called the MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. This year, or next year, will be the 7th year that the bill has been in session trying to be passed. So last year in Albany, when folks were saying this is the first time it's being talked about, it's not. It's been talked about for a while now. It's just the first time that people up high in Albany are listening to it being talked about. So what the MRTA is it's really based on 3 pillars, justice, equity, and reinvestment. So justice being addressing the past harms of marijuana prohibition that usually had involvement with the criminal justice system. So expunging more records than what was expunged with this decriminalization bill, resentencing folks who are currently incarcerated for those crimes. And then the equity piece of it is creating mechanisms to actually support equity and diversity within the industry, and not just saying that we're going to create it, but how are we going to create it? So that's through things like priority licensing to make sure that the licenses actually get into the hands of people who've been disproportionately impacted. But then beyond that, helping people run a successful business, because just having a license doesn't mean that someone's going to be able to have a business. And that's a lot of what Zach and NIR Kemp Lab is focused on, is like the incubator model. And what the MRTA has is state money to go to supporting incubator programs, and then also things from some money from licensing would go to supporting programs like that too. And then the final piece is reinvestment. So reinvestment back into communities that have been disproportionately impacted from marijuana prohibition, and doing that through tax revenue that's created from this legal marketplace. So we're really pushing for 50% of the tax revenue to be put into this new coffer for community reinvestment grants. And that would be money that communities have a say in how it's spent. So if that's workforce development programs, making new schools, fixing sidewalks, whatever that community feels needs to be reinvested back into it. And so that's really the bones of this bill, and yeah.
We could talk for days.
I could talk
on-
for days.
I just want to throw out again that there's also a component related to worker ownership as well.
Yeah,
And-
co-ops.
So, well, yeah,
Yeah.
co-ops, and I say worker ownership because it's a pretty broad category. It doesn't necessarily have to be a co-op, but any worker-owned businesses. But I guess I would be curious to know what, if you were to think about what you would like to see happen from a community reinvestment perspective, what would be what you would suggest to the state? Because that's really what they need to know.
Yeah.
It did not pass in the last session because there was not enough community voice and no real information that was coming directly from communities around what would they like to see. I mean, people, we can all sit down and say this is what should be in it, but what do you think?
Yeah.
So I'm a village trustee for a community that's in Livingston County. And at least in our community, we had a solar firm come in and they gave us $200,000 to the school district. And that went over really well. What I imagine, like as a community board member, we struggle with paying for things like ambulances or fire. Like we're struggling really hard to build a fire hall in our community. Like those things are monumental in our areas and we need them. But we don't have the money to, the state has regulations on like how the fire halls need to be built now, and we can't afford it. We don't even know how to do it because there's no way to do it. So like things like that, just in a rural community is really important to us.
And I think in the rural communities, that tax revenue is tax revenue that's going to be created from making sure that your communities don't opt out of legalization once it happens, because the Community Reinvestment Grant Fund is very specific to communities who've been disproportionately impacted from marijuana prohibition. So that's mostly cities. So, in specific community neighborhoods within those cities. So, police will often have like beats that are more targeted into specific neighborhoods, and then that has then led to a disproportionate number of marijuana arrests. And then when someone is arrested and prosecuted for low-level marijuana possession, it has collateral consequences in their life, like you don't have access to financial aid for college, you have certain, like you might not have access to housing, public assistance, and that type of thing. And so there's that money for the Community Reinvestment Grant Fund, but then that's only 50% of the tax revenue that we're trying to go for. There's still 50% of tax revenue to go towards other things like what your community would, feel like you need. But just to be clear that there's like a separate difference between Community Reinvestment Grant Fund and then tax revenue that's going to be created so long as communities don't opt out of this. And so opting out is a big thing too, like you being in a more rural community.
And which they already tried to do.
I know, yeah, Livingston County did, so I'd love to connect with you and see like how we can talk to the folks out there who want to opt out and get them more educated.
Well, and here's the thing too, like I might live in a small community and it's only 5,000, but our community is extremely diverse for being very small.
That's what I was going to say. I don't necessarily think that just because you come from a rural community, maybe you are disproportionately.
Yeah, and that's something that we're coming up with. What does disproportionately impacted mean, right? Because I don't have the definition, and that was something at the end of session that people were really asking questions on was, what does that mean? So
Mount Morris is considered like the little city in the rural community.
Okay, yeah.
So like we have 30% that are not white in our community, and for Livingston County, that's incredible. So we chose to live there because of the diversity.
because it is, yeah.
So I have a question, and it has to do with how tax revenues get used. And to tee it up with one word, I'm going to turn so I can see who else is in the room. Can it be catalytic? So it's not, let's make money over here and fix something that should have been fixed by something that, that shouldn't require funding here. Like if we need a new firehouse or something, that would be high on my list for regular tax revenue.
Right, that's a capital investment,
Right.
a capital budget, not necessarily the CRA budget, yeah.
And as long as this is kicked around in those terms, I think you're kind of stuck in this old way of thinking. And could it not be some other sort of new catalytic way of looking at it? I want to give you a short little story while I have the floor about something I worked on that never came to life, but maybe it can come to life here in Rochester. So I moved back to Rochester from Seattle last year. And while I was working in Seattle, one of my clients was a local community foundation called the Russell Family Foundation. And they're in Tacoma. And Tacoma is where it's at right now because Seattle has turned into San Francisco, gotten too big and too expensive and everything else. And if you want to see where the cool ideas are, it's actually a smaller sized city like Tacoma. And I would say that the same thing is happening in mid-sized cities around the country. So there's a real opportunity. Well, what happened in Tacoma? Their little setup here, right at the port of Tacoma, which goes into Puget Sound, there were years and decades ago chemical refineries built, and then they leaked and polluted the ground and the water, and it was a super fun cleanup site, and it took decades and it's still being cleaned up and it's a mess. Well, they finally reached a certain threshold of remediation and fixing things that the land could be put out again by the port for some sort of bid to what can we do on the space. Now you're never going to have like a farm or a park or anything there because there's all these chemicals that are still in the soil, and so only politicians would say, "I got it. We'll build another better, safer chemical plant in the same place because it's already zoned for that kind of thing." And what happened was outrage and an uprising by the community because they're like, we just spent decades cleaning up a mess like that. Why are we going to do that again? And the Russell Family Foundation was and still is very active in the community and very influential. And they put out the call for ideas like, what else could we do? Let's put our thinking caps on so we don't just build another, chemical refinery. And one of the ideas that got a lot of interest was, because in the state of Washington, cannabis in all its forms is legal, was how about we think of a creative way where we could use that as agricultural space, but instead of planting cannabis in the ground, we'll bring in shipping containers, there's plenty of them around at the port of Tacoma, and use that for self-contained hydroponic growing. And just as a plus up on that, we'll put solar panels on the top and have community solar, right? Who's going to have these? Well, now at a micro level, we can start to think about this as catalytic, and we could have different parts of the community, individuals, purchase or get a license, and it was within reach, cost-wise. And it could pay for, or be somewhat self-sustainable with the solar, and any surplus solar could be sold back. And it was a really creative idea to get better use out of this land, but also engage people who live in Tacoma at all levels of the economy to participate in it. And it also opened the door for adjacent industries like hydroponics. Well, now you need tubes and water and supplies and all this kind of stuff. So where's that thinking, right? So that's what I wanted to
That's
put on the
what's
table.
here. That's why we're here. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, but that's exactly what, I think needs to happen, because of course, I was just telling them earlier, I was on a phone call for 2 hours with Senator Bailey, who was one of the sponsors of the marijuana legislation, particularly in regards to the worker ownership opportunity. And what's happening is they need to hear from us, and that's why we need to be able to have these conversations, because I can guarantee you, if you put a lot of politicians in a room, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to find opportunities to either promote their own districts with something that they think, and it's not to say that you don't need another firehouse and that kind of thing, but I think realistically, there are ways to look at how do we fund this and how do we make it something that's, like you said, catalytic, that's a win-win for an entire community, even though it may have been a disproportionately negatively affected community in the past. So,
Yeah.
thank
Well,
you.
the last thing I'd say is that the reason I like that idea for a place like Rochester is it snows here. You know, and that could be a way to create, a mobile or, full year production.
I think that points to, there's both how do we engage, there's this how do we engage people for the business perspective, then there's the whole conversation, what do we do with the money, like there's the layers of conversation that need to happen, that if we're not talking about it today, then it is someone else directing the show. That
That's right.
it's not just about business, but it's also about how do we engage at all these different steps. That it takes so much perspective and engagement. And again, unless we're coming back to the table again and again, someone else is calling the shots down in Albany, and then we're losing. And that's where, like, again, having the ability to go down with ROC NORML, they've spent a year knocking on doors and actually seeing how accessible it is to, we have data, we have requests, this is what we're saying. Oh, we hear that community over there doesn't want cannabis. Well, do they know that if we don't legalize and don't tax it, there's no money to make the streets safer? Driving streets safer. There's all these layers that, like, the misinformation that is been woven into this, that it requires multiple levels of conversation. I think one of the things we hope to see it, that can we begin to split hairs as we have more of these conversations to branch off, different focus groups, because that's how it can make it more efficient and targeted. That this is where there's an action item that comes out of what Rochesterians want. And that's a big thing.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, for those who came in late, we were just talking about some of the opportunities that are around the new cannabis legislation that's currently in the legislature, which we believe will probably pass. So we're looking for community input on how that legislation affects people and what they would like to see happen. So
I just want to point out too, I'm a member of BRAC Normal, and I'm in commercial real estate. And right now, we're not even sure if the state will consider allowing greenhouses for cannabis, because technically it needs to be inside. So what does that mean? Could it be inside a greenhouse? Could it be inside a shipping container? And the people who are making these decisions are the politicians, who I'm sure have much less knowledge about that whole system than you do. And so on a very granular level, we need to tell them what it is that we are looking for, because they have no idea. In their mind, they're thinking, oh, well, let's just only have it inside, and let's just only have it in these types of buildings. Who knows? This could be something that they come up with because it's New York and we've been traditionally restricted. Well, what does that mean for rural communities then? Are they now not allowed to produce in greenhouses, or alternate ways of housing this? So I think that's a fantastic idea. I love that idea, and I just wanted to point out that these people who are making the decisions don't even have a clue about whether or not something like that would be allowed yet. And so we need to tell them as a community, these are our ideas and these are why, because if not, they're just going to sit there arbitrarily on their pen and be like, no, it makes sense, not outside. Okay. And then that completely doesn't address the nuance of the situation.
I think I give you more credit than you do, but but I agree with you on many levels that it's important.
Depends on who we talk to. And I think, again, it's like, so again, you guys who just showed up, it's like we kind of went through, like, what's going on with, like, hemp is marijuana just without THC, which gets you high. We kind of did an overview of what the medical looks like, what decriminalization, which is the existing marijuana laws. But yeah, we have, between the three of us, we have at least, a pretty good idea of what's going on. And so if there's, like, we just started talking about, like, what are opportunities for community reinvestment? Like, what does that even mean? And let alone, like, what other questions can we begin to bring out to begin to address?
Clearly there will be taxes.
Yeah.
Where do you want the tax money to go? Really?
Yeah, and what do you want businesses?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. My name is Rashad Smith. I've had the opportunity to work with Mary, with hopefully trying to bring more of the Black and Brown community to these discussions through my work in PR for WOGZ 105.5 FM. And so Mary actually will be on Sunday. We'll have this discussion, or some parts of this discussion, on Sunday at 1 p.m. for my show Community-ish. But I think it's important that there is a focus on the communities that have been negatively impacted by the laws of marijuana, and I think that that should be the focus first. One of the things that I would like to see, and I don't know if this is a part of the discussion or if you had this talk at the last listening session, but I would like to certainly see some sort of tuition-free education first to those who were criminalized from marijuana, and second, impacting those who are living in those neighborhoods. I don't know what the discussion is around that, but even having this discussion in here today, for many of the people who the laws have impacted, the way that we may communicate, I can understand clearly, but my brother who's on Avenue D, it might go straight over his head. And so being able to minimize or what word am I looking for?
Jargon.
Yeah, the jargon around the discussion to
Yeah.
make it relatable. And beyond jargon, really the channels that we're using to reach the audience that we say we want to reach. You know, what is the effort in doing that? I know Mary, she has been bugging my ears off with, you know, and I accept it and I take it, and I wanted to help, which was why I decided to support Roc NORML. But you know, what is the effort around that? Is there an opportunity for, you know, dollars to be invested into mediums that reach minority communities, which is another deal, because that begins to support black publications and mediums that are not as supported as the mainstream. So I just think that there's opportunity to be strategic, but I definitely think that the opportunity should first fall in the hands of those who have been negatively impacted by the laws, and then those communities that those people come from.
And I think seeing what we're up against and the force of nature of the beast that is the cannabis industry and the trillion-dollar industry that it is, unless there's not intentional effort and again knocking on the doors again and again with specific requests and the thought creation process of generating what can this look like, what can these programs look like, that like again, if Roc NORML and the group and Crystal People Stokes and there's a core group of individuals who are ensuring, they said no. At the end of the day, you know, the legalization fell short by 3 votes, but it also fell short because there was a certain threshold of like, if this isn't reinvesting, if this isn't the integrity that is bottom line required, then it can't go forward. And to a degree, like when it wasn't passed in April, everyone's all upset. I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah.
You know, great. I'd rather not have it passed, so it's an open field day for the existing like multinationals who are trying to come in and covet the space versus engaging. You know?
And I think that you've enlightened me, because I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think that a lot of folks from the communities that I serve, I think that their thought process is, let's just legalize it so we can smoke, which I'm cool for too. But there's so much behind that folks are not understanding, and they may not necessarily, they're not gonna understand the jargon used in Albany, you know, that's gonna, you know, so I think that we have to have, and I'm willing to do that with supporting Roc NORML through the station, but really meeting the community where they are and doing whatever we can so that people can constantly talk about it so that we can make it how it should be.
Absolutely. And just from so we started talking about like incubator concept and like one thing, so NYHempLab is a registered 501c3 and our whole thing is educate, incubate, accelerate. And I think that just hearing that voice of like, my mind's like, okay, I've already been developing what I'm calling a seed to sale education, like whether it be 10-month or just, you know, 4 a week long where you meet once a week and you can actually talk about the industry, because until people can actually see the full picture, you don't know how to get involved. You might think you want to be a grower, but you might not have, have you ever tried growing, let alone like maybe your skill set and your community or like your colleagues could step in a different place. So it's like actually beginning to paint the picture in a way that normalizes the conversation versus being technical, because there's this whole technical process. We can talk about this and that, but like bottom line, what are we talking about when we talk about cannabis? And from it being planted in the soil and all the businesses that operate around it that get it to someone smoking it or consuming it in whatever way, shape, or form. And that's one, there's a normalization of cannabis in general. Like we're still talking like it's this evil when it's literally it's an ancient plant that has been, just criminalized through racism intentionally, and big business that didn't want to see hemp being used anymore, and didn't want to see, the list goes on about why it was targeted in the way that it was and why it was made illegal. And so breaking that threshold is a whole hurdle in itself. Like one of my colleagues, Galen, we were speaking at this event down in Albany, and he said this thing, I thought it was so radical for the first second I heard it. He's like, I want kids working on cannabis. Like, I want kids in high schools working with cannabis. I'm like, dude, you can't say that. And I'm like, but he's like, but that's where the minds are. I want them looking at the fiber. I want them looking at all these different things. They're like, oh yeah, that's me being afraid of the stigma of like still thinking we're talking THC when we're talking about a plant with all these different things that,
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Even when pitching to my colleagues at the station, like I was like, weed, pop, 14. That was how I was talking.
Yeah.
And so everybody's like, but I think that's important too. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there's two really different things that we're talking about when we talk about like the incubator model and creating this equity within the industry and having scholarships in the incubator and things like that. But then there's also reinvesting in communities that want nothing to do with the industry. They don't want to have anything to do with the business side of it. They've just been disproportionately impacted. And I think, Rashad, that's what you were speaking to is like college tuition, right? Like just like
or program certificates.
Yeah, and I think
to be able to go into the business.
And that is something that like the Community Reinvestment Grant Fund is the way that it was modeled in the bill right now, which we're on the C version, it'll probably be the triple C version by the time we pass it, but what it looks like right now is that it would be like a group made up of community members who would then kind of have like a vote into how the money for their community is going to be spent. So if the people in that community decide we want it to go to this scholarship program that is for people to go back to school, then that's what it gets spent towards. It's really right now is the ideas coming through, but the legislation has mechanisms in place for like who's the actual community members
So
that will decide.
realistically, if you were to talk about how those funds get appropriated, they would go through the state legislature would allocate them to either the counties or the cities, probably both, in which cases the county and city legislatures would make decisions about that, in which case your input to them would certainly drive a lot of that. But I think that it really has to start from having a sense of what your interest is, because when you go to city council, you're going to have to go to them with a proposal, for funding, and that gets voted on in a budget on an annualized basis. They don't just throw the money around. So that's why the thinking about this has to happen at a distance.
So it's like a grant-based sort of concept?
It's not a grant. It's like, okay, so the city of Rochester generates all of its revenue through taxes and through state and federal appropriations, right? All of that is appropriated, everything from the fire department to the police, the roads and streets and all that. But then there's also funds like we're talking here. Like, for example, remember when the cigarette industry had the same issues? There had to be decision making about what that tax funding was going to be allocated towards. And all of that gets decided at a local level, either in the state, in the city, or in the county.
I was going to ask if there's another way to come at this, because a lot of what I'm hearing is, all right, there's legislation, and then how do we shape that, and then offer it up to somebody with our fingers crossed, because then what's going to happen? You're still in the world of establishment of political systems and business influence, and what kind of donations are skewing the decision-making process. So what I was curious about is, are there other vectors, other ways in to get some ideas started as sort of proof of concept? And this is another benefit having lived in Seattle, in the area. The tribes, the Native American tribes there have a lot of money from a lot of different ventures, but they have a lot of political clout, and they also have a lot of flexibility. And so some of the things that the foundations and nonprofits that I worked with would do some experimenting and partnering with the local tribes. Is there anything like that here, or some other way to kind of get some momentum
There
going?
have been attempts at that, but I'll tell you, the Native American populations here are often, they view themselves, and they're often viewed by government as a sovereign nation. So they're a little bit more challenging to do these types of partnerships with, because as a sovereign nation, they exist independently, financially, geographically, politically, and they can do whatever they want. So whatever. And so that's been some of the apprehension, and I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'll give you an example. Think about the casinos, right?
Yeah.
There's always an uproar whenever there's a new casino being introduced, and it's always about this whole threat of the sovereign nation not necessarily following whatever agreements you come to, because they really don't have to. So I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but I'm just telling you, there's a little bit of a tension, and I'm not saying it's there permanently, but that's what I've observed.
Are you suggesting that getting like kind of a coup from the inside, like having them do their own program within the state and being like, hey guys, they're doing this here?
Yes. Think of it this way. What if you came up with like this sort of dream team way of getting around the slow-moving, possibly roadblock-filled political process, and if it was maybe there's a willing local tribe and Cornell, the land-grant institution here.
Well, I think there's something even
Just-
more tangible. Like, let's talk about cannabis and keep it just like with like where it is today. Like everything we learn on hemp is applicable to cannabis all around. So CBD hemp it's ready to go. And so from a like just education model, workforce development model, business building, like I don't like the language of HempLab, like hemp is the doorway to cannabis, is the doorway to ag and horticulture. Like it's like we can do everything today with hemp. We can bring people to the table, teach them how to take clones, teach them how to transplant, teach them how to sell it, or what's the packaging standards, like all the way through. And to me, there's already money in from the state to begin to do that kind of educational engagement, where we can build programs that are tailored to everyone from the farmer to anyone in the city who, it's like there's a multitude of ways to build it. And that's where I think strategic relationships and community engagement creates a platform where like we're ready to go today if we don't think we have to wait for marijuana. It's like that's a farce, and that's so you can begin to build the engagement, bring more people to the table, bring culture, bring comfort, bring legitimacy, and kind of destigmatize cannabis through this lens that then opens the doorway for, okay, more people are hearing about it, more people have touched it, more people have some experience, some jobs, and some insight as to how they can play into this to begin to then develop businesses. So I'm a firm believer that it's here today, and it's which is great. And again, but still, more people need to be part of the conversation. More funding routes need to be identified to bring to the table. Again, I'm pretty darn certain that between FLCC and MCC and these local community colleges that there's opportunity to do certificates through workforce development training that at least gives people language, hands-on experience, jobs, and opportunity to see where there's opportunities to like innovate. And so I think that's here today, and that's part of what we're looking at for 2020 of like, okay, 1.0 is like, let's like create this multifaceted educational space where people can come learn, get hands-on experience, build credit, build a resume, what have you. That then translates into experience that, that's foundational.
I think that I work in an incubator type space in entrepreneurship at the University of Rochester, and those kind of channels are already there. So you just need to tap into every partner with them, because they have these small business entrepreneurship incubator type things there, and a lot of them are actually free. Like we have a Buzz Lab boot camp that's free to anyone in Rochester. It is a $25 fee. We will waive it. If you say you cannot pay it, we will waive it. You get free lunch for 4 weeks. We will teach you business skills. And all of this can be applied. Like we can do tracks. So there's a possibility that there could be a hemp truck. And we've done art ones, we've done other ones too. So like those are different possibilities within the Rochester area too.
So I thought I've heard this implied, but I just want to say it explicitly. To me, if you're going to take the tax money and make it catalytic in the communities, I think it has to address the things that stop entrepreneurs from developing businesses. Access to capital has always been, and these incubator business education opportunity things, because they won't survive, you know, if you just put them out there and say go at it.
Right.
I still am not sure how the, you know, what is going to protect them from the megacorps that are going to come flying into this.
I'd say that about anyone stepping in this industry, like, there's literally the risk that, like, all of us in this room, doesn't matter. Like, if you're not already in the club, like, you're out. And that's this crazy reality of we're still talking about, are we gonna legalize it 2020, 2021, where it's like, okay, they're all talking about mergers and acquisitions with billion-dollar budgets. And it's like, there's this dichotomy of like, that I think doesn't, no matter who you are, if there's not the infrastructure, the support, access to capital, and one of the things like rooted in the MRTA is low interest, no interest loans. And I think that's incredibly important. Like, how do we give that, and the connection with the incubator, that it's not just giving money, it's like you have to have that support. It's a baby. Like, I've been trying startup and I failed so many times. And it's just like how much you need to learn at every step of the way, and having that insight, the expertise is critically important for all business, let alone people who are just, you know, maybe doing their first startup.
And what we're trying to do is, in the legislation, make it, you know, we can't prevent big business from coming into this industry, but we are trying to put as many kind of protections in place for the small business growth as possible. So having a multi-tier licensing structure built into this legislation is really important, preventing vertical integration, or as much as we can. So the two biggest things that made this bill fail last year were the point about licensing, how the licensing structure is going to play out. Governor Cuomo is very much in favor of vertical integration and having it be just kind of handed over to big businesses.
Mary, maybe you could explain that to
Vertical integration. So vertical integration is when you have all of the licenses in the chain from seed to sale. So
You're
you
a grower, processor,
Yeah.
extractor, sales, all the way through.
everything. So that's why those licenses were so expensive, because it was not just a cultivation license, it was an everything license. And so the businesses right now in the medical program hold these vertically integrated licenses, and they're literally just waiting for adult use to pass, and then they want to have a play in the marketplace. So we are trying to figure out, how do we allow some of them in to get adult use licenses, but not in a way where there's this oligopoly that's going to be formed, that's going to have complete price control and shut out all the small businesses and never have a chance for equity or diversity. So that was one of the big fighting points, and we're still trying to negotiate on that and figure out how to make it equal, or as equal as possible for people. And then the other point was the tax revenue. Governor Cuomo wants it to go into the general fund, and we're really set on needing it to go to community reinvestment. So,
But back on the first point of the
licensing.
and how do you allow the disenfranchised, the disproportionately affected communities to be involved, has anyone thought of or proposed, I mean, I don't think it works great, but at least it's an approach that everybody understands when in the other state spending where there's a, you know, for lack of a more succinct term, a minority set aside, it's, you know, for diverse businesses.
yeah. But
I mean, I don't know how you could tie it to a community, but you could take that same kind of concept.
so that's the priority licensing piece of it. So to make it so these licenses actually get into the hands of folks from communities that have been disproportionately
Maybe I'm not
impacted.
understanding. So if I get if I'm in a community that's been disproportionately affected, and you gave me a license,
Right,
I still got to compete with
right. So-
Megacorp, who's just going to run me right out of the business, as opposed to I give Megacorp the license, but say you have to involve these people, or you're in violation of your license.
We have seen states that have tried to do that model, where like your business plan needs to have X number of people that have been disproportionately impacted, or you know, you have this many women, this many people of color. What ends up happening is they literally just get their tokens, they just get bought into like the business plan, and then don't actually have a say in the business model that's going on. So like that is a way to try and approach it. I don't think that's what's being proposed right now in the legislation, because really it's what we see is these big companies come in that they're just not giving those people a say in the business, and they're paying them off essentially. So there's that.
It would seem to me that would, I don't know, I'm not gonna say.
Well, because
that's competing with a model that says, here, you have a license to open a dispensary.
But that's
in
not where the
Rochester, but
legislation stops.
Next door, the McDonald's of dispensaries.
Can I ask
come
you a
to
question?
Pennsylvania.
How likely do you think that would get passed in our state legislature?
I have no idea.
I would say there'd be a low likelihood of passing that legislation.
So what we're doing is, in addition to the priority licensing, is also setting up these no interest loans for folks, and it wouldn't be for anyone. It would be for the same folks where the priority licensing is being applied to. And then in addition to that, the incubator programs that they would have access to. So it is kind of the three parts of get them the license, then get them the money to start at the business, then the incubator program to support the business.
Why not grants as opposed to loans?
Yeah,
Because again, the likelihood of getting a bill passed that provides grants is very low. Let's face it, we live in a first of all, the state of New York, as we know, is a divided state, right? You've got the downstate interest, you've got the upstate interest, you've got certain counties that are more likely to be swayed one way politically, and so you have to present the bill that has the most opportunity to be universally accepted and adopted on a nonpartisan basis. And so a grant, I think, when people think about that, is very much, again, go back to the cigarette, issue. I mean, there were no grants. It was like you have to be able to find a way to make those funds available in such a way that they're not going to be looked as a handout. There's a large contingency of people who would view a grant as just that, as a handout.
Yeah, I mean, there's no secret, it is.
Right.
Because the people that need it can't pay back loans.
Right. But
You know?
I know, but that's why, but you can zero interest loan. People would go for a zero interest loan before they go for a grant. Or you could do a combination. You can say you meet these certain criteria, and if you meet them, then it becomes a grant. If you do not, then there's, but I'm just saying, from a business perspective, you have to look at it from
And
what the cost.
you know politics.
Yeah.
I don't know politics, but I'm thinking as a citizen who
I know.
and I go to the corner store and I know that Bobby cannot pay back a loan, but he might be an educated man who had to make some decisions to survive. And so I'm just thinking on those.
No, maybe that's something that the community reinvestment grant, again, like maybe that's what the community decides is, okay, these businesses that got those no interest loans, we're gonna put part of our grant money to go to them to pay off their loan, so it wasn't a loan that got this grant. So I think that there's ways that the grant model can come into play, because there's a lot of, we're not talking about like $1 million, right? There's billions of dollars to be made over
The idea
years.
that you talked about was a loan, a conditional loan, that if you meet certain benchmarks, gets converted to a grant. I don't know why that would be politically intelligent.
Or a percentage of it. However, there's ways to really get around. There's ways to do that creatively, but I'm just saying in terms of how people view these things, I think that they are much more open to that kind of a creative financing opportunity.
There's also the reality too. It's like it's hard to start a business. It's hard to run a successful business. Like it's just fact.
And to make
And the
money
other
in
thing
this
is, when I
industry.
think about those funds, and it is, if we're looking at billions of dollars, I would not want to see them given away as grants. I want it to be something that generates more money, that you can continue to do that. And that's the issue I would have. I mean, I would have an issue with that. There's an end to where those grants go, and then that money's just gone. Right?
It's a regenerative
But if
fund,
you have an opportunity to continue to regenerate those funds and allocate them and have more impact over time, I would much prefer to see that.
Can I just also interject too? So I sit on a board, so I'm familiar with all that fun jargon that she's talking about by saying, having a grant versus something else. And I think to your point when you were talking about tuition free, it's a lot easier to go to the legislature and say, okay, just for easy math, $10,000. Instead of giving someone a $10,000 grant towards their business, giving $10,000 in free tuition or scholarship money is a lot easier of a sell than saying, we'll give you money for your business. So it's kind of a grant, but in a different way. You have to sort of dress it up a little bit differently. So instead of them maybe having to get instead of getting $10,000 in a business grant, it's like a scholarship versus them having to take out $10,000 in student loans to cover that. You know, so the costs have mitigated maybe in a different way. And I think that was the point that Kate was trying to make.
I get it, and I guess that my ask is that when representing the people, that we be strategic in what that package looks like, and still be able to win over whatever the vote or whatever it is that we need, but keeping in mind the realities once you leave Albany and come to Clinton.
Yeah, and it comes down to like Rochester is going to choose what Rochester can do, and that's where like if we're not talking, then who in Rochester is making that choice, and to what degree does it actually trickle down into Abdi versus stay over on Monroe? Versus it's like there's not a web. It goes as far as our voice goes, and so you're right on point. And it comes back down like if we're not talking about this, no one else is, and that's a problem.
So I'm going to throw out a plug right now because with Only Rochester, we actually have a revolving loan fund that we do provide loans to low-income people within all of the most challenged neighborhoods in the city, and they're not zero interest, but they're probably the lowest interest you can go. And we also are much more understanding of the financial capabilities of the people that we're lending to. And so if you go to a bank and you come from a neighborhood, or you come from a financial situation where you really have no access to capital at all, then we can look at that and we can find other ways to qualify a person, but we will certainly still charge interest rate because we want to be able to continue to make those loans to other people. But at the same time, we know that there's a very different criteria that we have to be able to make available to people who are in need. Because otherwise, that's the reason they're in that situation, because they don't have access to capital. They can't do. So if you continually look at through the lens of most banks and other financial institutions would look through, then you're going to continue to perpetuate that same deficit. So we have to find ways to do it. And I think that those are in place, so that can happen right now. But we do it really for conversion to worker-owned businesses and also to small businesses that need.
What's that loan?
It's actually called we got funding from the state, and it's going to be, we haven't allocated any loans yet, but we will be starting in January. But it's called the Rochester Revitalization Fund, and we're doing worker-owned business loans for conversions.
Now, can I ask,
Yeah.
would those loans apply to a cannabis-based business?
Once it's legalized, yes.
I mean, not only once it's legalized recreationally, but for, like, I own a CBD store. I have a really hard time finding any companies that support any kind of cannabis business. I have to pay a lot more money for insurances and pretty much anything that I go through because there's so many, not just like loans, but anything. Like, people don't want to deal with cannabis whatsoever.
Our loans would be available, but the other thing is, remember the real target for our loans is to really encourage people to go into worker-owned businesses. Doesn't mean you have to be, because there are other, we could provide loans to other businesses as well. But we look for people to really find ways to spread the wealth by creating worker-owned businesses that generate profits that get spread across a larger population of people.
Yeah, and I'll vouch, I strongly believe that there's how much money is in this industry, that the opportunity to have people who have ownership, which is, right now there's a supply chain in Rochester. You can go get whatever amount of cannabis you want that's connected to relationships, webs of organizations of people, that they have a certain, profit margin that they get. They have a certain buy-in and ownership within that. And so to a degree like that, there's maybe there's businesses that will come in, there's opportunities to get a job, but there is already these webs of business organizations that that people already have livelihood that are bought into, that creating models where I would choose to keep going to my friend who I've been going to for years. And so having the brand, having the community relationship, having these things that are really kind of existent but illegitimate, that are tied into ownership and community. Again, I'm more likely to go to Zach's weed shop than McDonald weed shop because I know 5 people who work for that and have ownership and all the way back. And I strongly believe in the ownership model as a way to have brand identity that's way different, that has deeper roots in relationship and community, that can deal with the boom and bust of the cannabis. I mean, I had the privilege and like the fear to watch the price of cannabis out west drop from $1,500 a pound wholesale to $300 a pound wholesale. And if your business model isn't designed to, and you don't have the right network, the right ecosystem, the right brand, like you better be praying with everyone else who's getting pushed out, flooded out by massive companies who are filling the market. So there's all these layers that come in that like, I personally see that and would hope that the more people can have more ownership because it's more Rochester based. It's more, and not to say that I can't scale beyond it, but there is that level of like, the more the community can continue to connect with the community, then the more that those dollars will go. You know, we know the dollar goes twice as far in a community-owned business or versus a Walmart-owned business.
I have a question, maybe one of you can help answer around decriminalization and expungement. How folks who have been impacted by this, how are they being informed? How do they know what the new rules, laws may be? And what is the process for them to remove that from their records?
So there's nothing really that the state is doing to inform people of this, other than, you know, their press releases and things like that. And to everything that's been communicated to us, this is going to be an automatic thing that's going to happen with people's records being expunged. So, yeah, the next question is how are we going to remove that? Yeah, then what happens when it's not automatic? Yeah. So we have BRAC Normal is part of the Start Smart New York Coalition, which is dozens of organizations and individuals and lawyers across New York State, Drug Policy Alliance, NYCLU, a bunch of folks who are watching this. And by August 2020, I think it is when they said that everyone's record is going to automatically be expunged. Now, the way that they're probably going to do that is through something like probably like what we saw in San Francisco with like, I don't know exactly what they'll do, but Code for America. They developed something where there was code that they wrote that automatically expunged people's records.
Basically aggregates everyone's information that's in the system, and then that allows it to be like, okay, select and click to expunge. But then there's a question, what about the people who fall through the cracks?
Right, we
what
know
about
computers
people who
aren't perfect. I work for software.
Yeah.
Let's say this works perfectly.
Yeah.
There's always one. Okay.
People just run free.
Okay, so my record's expunged. Then what?
It's
Because-
like Juneteenth, you'll find out a year later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even that, but no, let's say everything you wish for happens just exactly the way you want. Then what? Because the way I understand this, like, if I have a conviction, especially if it's a felony conviction, I have just been rendered unemployable for my entire adult life.
Can't vote. Can't, you know,
Right.
it's like,
And so it's one thing to like, oh, I'm just gonna erase this off your record, but it's
How does
something else
everything
to
know?
like start to really repair the damage.
yeah.
And what's
That's
happening there?
There's actually a national movement, the National Expungement Week. This was the second year I think they did it.
Yeah.
But that there's like, you begin to see these actors that are like galvanizing, bringing people to the table to help track.
It's up to community. Yeah.
But it's really like these grassroots level of people that are building momentum to build the awareness. You know, how many billboards do we need to have in Rochester? So like 50% of the city has an awareness that this is even a thing. You know, and that's where that's where partnerships, I think, with some of these national players who are working on these expungement weeks that are like make it a big an event basically to come in and to come learn and to see, and then you could easily see like, yeah, where there's the getting rid of, but then where's the reintroduction to skills, to rights, to etc. That actually creates a bridge versus it's just another void that we say we did that and it's not actually
I see it as a
integration.
business opportunity.
Yeah, there we go.
And what about the coulda, shoulda, woulda, the reparations? You know, I'm not successful because I was in jail for 10 years.
Totally.
Any talk about that? I know that reparations is a sort of a hot topic or not. But any talk about that?
No, I think that's what we did. We used to use the word reparations in the coalition when talking about community reinvestment grants. We stopped doing that because reparations is a word that some people feel one way about, other people feel another. But that's kind of the idea behind it, is the community reinvestment grant being a form of reparations that, you know, you did get 10 years of college education taken away from you, and now you're 40 years old starting school, you're 30 instead of 20 starting school, and what does that do to your life? Not only your life, but your family and your community and the ripple effects that has, which is why it's so critically important that we have the community reinvestment grants, because we're not going to get anything that says reparations in this bill, talking about realistic things to be asking for, but the community reinvestment grant is something very realistic and is something that, having people who, you all have this hat right now on in this room that you care about cannabis in some way, shape, or form, but when you leave this room, you have a million other hats that you wear, and those hats can intersect with this issue, and that's where your voice becomes really powerful. So if you're a parent, or if you're involved in education, or if you're involved in any type of business, those things are really powerful when we're talking to our lawmakers. And if you're able to come with us to Albany at any time next session and say, I'm an XYZ community member, and this is important to me because, and then you have BRAC Normal as the lobbyist in there being able to speak to, and here's where it would be in the legislation, here's where this is important to make that stick. So just be thinking about like what other hats you wear that intersect with this issue, or that you might not even think intersect with this issue, and your voice is really powerful because they get sick of hearing mine.
But also don't forget that as it gets closer, you can always talk to your representative. I mean, those phone calls to the representatives do count. I mean, I do it all the time when there's something coming up, and you have to kind of understand. I guess we can probably ROC Normal can make you aware when there's an opportunity to call, because those phone calls make a difference.
Yeah.
They do collect them. They know how many they're getting.
We filled up voicemails last year.
So that's just something any individual can do.
Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to go to Albany, like for the individual who may be interested? What is the expectation? What's the commitment?
Yep. So we organize lobby days throughout the session, statewide lobby days. So we'll get buses for people to 5 o'clock, get on the bus, because it takes 4 hours to get to Albany. And the expectation for people is we'll do like a brief lobby day training on the bus up to Albany. And really it's up to you how you want to be involved. We have rallies that happen at Albany, so if you just want to go and hold a sign and be a person that's there supporting the issue, that's something that you can do. If you want to use your voice and have some way that cannabis prohibition has impacted you and you want to tell your personal story, we can work with people to help you make your story, to help you kind of like shape your story, so you're not just going in there talking for the first time, like role play with people before and make them feel comfortable with going in and talking to lawmakers. But that's a lot of it, is just making sure that people feel comfortable going into it before, because people want to hear what we have to say. Most times in Albany, like they have meetings about boring stuff all day long. They love the cannabis meetings, really, because it's something that's interesting to them that they don't hear a lot about. And these stories of people who've been directly impacted of, I got arrested for having a joint, and then that made it so I couldn't get access to financial aid, or that I had a CPS case opened and I lost custody of my child. And those types of stories, to have our lawmakers really hear how marijuana prohibition is impacting people's day-to-day lives, then makes the things that we're fighting for hold that much more value, because it supports the individual stories.
What would a day look like getting ready to go to Albany?
We give people like the dress code to wear, so it's like, kind of professional, just no t-shirts, I want to wear this to Albany. So we'd give people guidance on dress code, and then the day would look like, taking the bus up there.
What time would I get up and meet?
You would meet us at 5 o'clock. Yeah, you'd meet us at 5 o'clock for the bus. And then we get to Albany by around, we make one stop on the way, get to Albany around 10 o'clock.
That stop is for food?
Yeah, food, smokes, bathroom.
Okay.
It's a pretty quiet morning bus ride.
Yeah, usually. And then we get to Albany, and if it's a big lobby day, we'll meet with all the other organizations around the state. So we've had lobby days of 300 plus people that gather in Albany. And sometimes there's other organizations there doing the same thing. Like we've been there when farmers have been there, nurses, teachers. And so you meet in the concourse with everyone, and then you kind of go through the day. We'll have schedules made of I have to organize meetings with our representatives before we go there, so I'm bothering them Caitlin and I bother them for weeks beforehand. And we'll have an agenda for our meetings, and then I'll also know beforehand who wants to go into the meetings with us, so I'll know who you're a constituent of, so who your actual representative is. And then it's all very organized in that way, and that you'll go into this meeting you'll have a meeting lead, so you wouldn't just ever go into a meeting by yourself. You'd have someone like from myself or someone else from BRAC Normal or another organization, and they're there to run the meeting, and then at some point in the meeting, they would introduce you to, say what you would like to say.
So this is probably gonna pass, this legislation. It's pretty sure, because, the other states are already passing it, Massachusetts, New Jersey's gonna pass. So just know that whenever you go, whatever your voice is gonna have a significant impact on how whatever the legislation becomes is really rolled out into the community.
And we have direct lines through our coalition to the actual sponsors on the bill, so we have had a hand in writing the versions that have been introduced. I mean,
But I've literally said, I don't like what that says, wrote
get it changed.
the office, and then watched them change it.
They change
And
it.
it's like to that degree of like, you literally have that level of input, which is incredible.
And so when is that next visit to Albany?
So we'll be going to Albany for the first time. They don't tell us when session actually starts, so we're gonna plan on like last week of January right now is the first time. And then we're gonna be there 6 times at least before April.
Because April 1st is when the budget passes, and the
Gotcha.
first swing is to get it with the budget. The second swing is before session's over, mid-June. So
And it's actually gonna be mid-May this year because they're gonna be campaigning,
Oh,
so they're all
yeah.
leaving early and
Oh,
coming
yeah.
back in December. It's a
So
really
the
short
I'm sorry, the
session.
budget passes in April?
April 1st.
And then session is over in May?
Like May 15th this year.
My name is Carly Rowland. I am co-chair of the membership committee with Mary. So we've been trying to organize folks who would be interested in volunteering, whether it's in lobby day or whether it's getting the word out about our events or if we're going to be canvassing. So if you guys want more information on how we can sort of integrate that, we have a monthly membership meeting that we have scheduled. So obviously you can always talk to Mary, but you can talk to me about that kind of stuff too, and we can kind of direct you in the direction of some of those resources too.
I also just want to ask, I can't remember what the group of organizations that you said kind of are like helping people understand. What is
Start Smart.
Start Smart?
Mhm.
Okay. I'm wondering, do they have anything available? Because I think that there's like a lot of like confusion. People think that like with certain kind of charges or even felonies, that it's impossible for them to kind of interact with the community and like for tuition, for college and things like that. And there are ways around it. Like I have definitely like helped people navigate through like getting college tuition. My ex-boyfriend is a 2-time felon actually, and he was able to, it was kind of like a glitch in the system that made it that way, and so he thought that he would never be able to go to college or get jobs or anything like that. And there are like ways, it's more paperwork to do, but
And even with the drug charge he had?
yes,
Oh.
with the drug charge, and it was one drug charge, but the way that it was, he was like indicted on it, it made it 2 basically, yeah. So it was, he thought that, he would never be able to, and I mean, he's since graduated college, he works, he's, living a normal life. So it's like there are ways around it, and I think that not a lot of people are educated on even like how to deal with things when they are in that situation, even before it gets expunged, and if it's gonna be that far out, like August of 2020, people don't have to wait to kind of like get through that. There are processes and ways around things like that so that they can be a part of the community as well. And I'm wondering if maybe they have any information. And I think we've talked about it before at our meeting, just about like, especially like the youth and, people like just connecting them with something so that they're understanding their rights right now.
Yeah.
And when things go legal, just like, I think it's really, really important. I think that a lot of people would avoid so many situations just, criminally if they knew their rights.
Yeah,
So
no,
in
you're
reality
right.
too, like in the current, the 2014 bill that governs hemp, like you can't be in the industry without like, I mean, there's probably exceptions, but if you have a felony charge and even misdemeanors, they want to know. So like
Right.
even something that's there today, It's like, you might not be able to participate, let alone the language in the cannabis industry. So to that degree of like, we're talking potential, but yeah, there's existing, what's today between that gap and that time? How do we actually engage people today? Again, it comes back to like, how do you destigmatize even just talking about it to create the container that allows for people to have an understanding of what's possible moving forward, let alone opportunities, but also like, yeah, the baseline levels of education that are required that, again, that takes a community's intention, because it's not going to be the state that's going to make it happen.
Right.
And then creating the culture that it's actually like a cool thing to do, to come and be part of that learning. Or, you know, is it an event? Is it like beginning to actually build what the identity of such an education platform looks like, that can actually have scope that goes beyond, you know, that has, again, more of the web-like impact. Those are huge questions.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm thinking even like things, you know, young kids who are like, you know, maybe getting arrested for having weed or drugs or something like that, and then, you know, they're not even understanding what their rights are, maybe can't afford a good lawyer or anybody who's even going to put in the work to help them understand it, and then they're just taking a plea.
Oh, totally.
And, you know, the judge is just going to take it, even though they may have certain rights that would dismiss that case altogether.
Totally.
You know, I've seen that happen in youth groups that I've worked with, and, you know, talking to young adults that are affected by the system, and, you know, especially in communities that can't really, you know, afford a high-paid lawyer or somebody that's gonna like put in that work. They just want to take a plea out, and, you know, the difference that it would make if people were even just educated on their general rights.
Is there talk around like marketing, advertising campaigns for education purposes? Like to talk to people, to inform communities about, I sort of talked about this earlier, but I'm thinking like, you know, I mean, anything from PSAs to actual paid marketing and advertising campaigns to get folks informed about what's going on, needing your input, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe it's too soon for that, but once it eventually happens, will there be, can we have some of those dollars go towards that?
I think it's a great idea. We don't have any plans for that. We need money and sponsors, so if anyone knows people with money that want to support this cause, send them our way.
Well, I don't even mean from like BRAC Normal.
No, but it,
No.
But no,
it
the
still
state,
costs
no.
money, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. So
Yeah.
Right.
bottom line here is.
What about
right,
Causeway?
yeah.
Causewave,
Yeah.
we haven't reached out to them.
We're still just in the beginning stages of having conversations with people. Obviously, the whole know your rights thing is definitely huge. We plan on going forward with that, and you're absolutely right. Needing to make sure that there's public information that gets disseminated. All that can happen.
Yeah.
And that's where these bigger coalitions and specific asks to these bigger coalitions, and Mary's part of it. If there's an understanding of a clear opportunity, I think that's something that's accessible.
Yeah,
I
like
do ask
this
Mary
piece.
on behalf of, I've managed Causewave's Race and Media project. And so I ask on behalf of Causewave, and of course ask somebody who negotiates media buys.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
I have a question. For the individuals who had public assistance, such as Section 8 or formerly housing voucher program, some of those individuals lost their vouchers on the account of being involved in a weed charge. I come from a community that is very well affiliated and associated with that particular area. My name is Amber DeWitt, by the way. I'm founder of Control Alt Delete and JAWI, which is Justice Around Unexposed Issues. But my question today is, does anyone know any specifics on how those individuals, a lot of mothers like myself, can get those vouchers back, given the fact that it is going to be passed and we're no longer going to be...
Right.
In the legislation, we do have like provisions for that. So, you know, if someone had lost their voucher because of a positive THC test, like they would. I don't know how it would work exactly for vouchers, because I know that you're like on a super long waiting list for that. So I'd like to talk to you more about that to see like what type of specific language we would need about that specifically. I know that we do address like moving forward, if you test positive for THC, it won't be qualification for you to lose that voucher. But the folks that have already lost it, yeah.
That would be a conversation probably with the Rochester Housing Authority too, you know.
Yeah, and it's something at the local level that we
Control
could do,
vouchers.
like, we have the state that we can go to try and get this worked in legislation, but we also have like local offices and
Because that's
policy
all-
that we can work around.
It's funded federally by HUD. through Rochester Housing Authority and National
Yeah.
Authority, so.
Just to,
Oh, we're
yeah, we're
very
just
fast.
addressing the time, yeah, we're hitting that threshold. But I think just, again, this is the conversation continues. Like, it doesn't just stop here. It continues in our households. It continues with our community members, our friends, our allies, and it continues in this space that we're intending to keep creating. And so I think that just this level of feedback and engagement is inspiring, and also a stepping stone of like, we need to keep going forward, because look at how many threads here that we could follow out to a specific action, let alone just a conversational piece to begin to kind of gather this data. So just truly, yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This was really, I took so many notes.
If you're not already following BRAC Normal and NIR Kemp Lab and on Facebook, and please go there. Please go to the website, sign up for the mailing list. Be part of the conversation. And I'm on the board of Kemp Lab.
Yeah.
We'll be doing 2 more.
Yeah.
We don't have a relocation for next.
We're
We
down.
have another one in November and one in December.
Yeah.
In the northeast part of town and in the northwest as well. So we're trying to hit all 4 parts.
And so if you, just from a perspective of like a follow-up, identifying key places to host these conversations, like, thank you very much for allowing us to have this space. Yeah.
Thank you.
Because these kind of places allow it to happen again and again. So references and referrals, just helping us connect the dots are really essential. So thank you. Great.
Thanks,
And
everyone.